Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to Reading Redhawks. My name is Stephanie Jameson, and I serve as the Assistant Director for Mission, Spirituality, and Vocation in the Office of Alumni Engagement here at Seattle University. As we begin our gathering, we respectfully acknowledge that while we are physically located all over the world, we are all on occupied Indigenous land, and Seattle University is located on the occupied Coast Salish land, is on the homelands of the Duwamish people. We pay respect to Coast Salish elders, past and present, and extend that respect to their descendants and to all Indigenous people. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its longer history and our place in that history, and it is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this region, whose practices and spiritualities were and are tied to the land and the water, and whose lives continue to enrich and develop in relationship to the land, waters, and other inhabitants today. And this Reading Redhawk session on Vanguard, how Black women broke barriers, won the vote, and insisted on equality for all is led by SU professor Dr. Holly Slay Ferraro. Holly's research examines how people grapple with dimensions of self, for example, age, race, and gender, in making career decisions and in various contexts such as family businesses. She is also interested in how organizational and institutional practices contribute to struggles with aspects of identity. Her aim is to add to our knowledge of how growth, learning, and superior performance occur in the face of forces that cause people to question their beliefs about who they are or who they should be. And she has published articles in Human Relations, Human Resource Management Group, and Organizational Management in the Journal of Leadership and Organizational Studies. Her research on midlife and mid-career transitions won a cutting-edge award from Academy of Human Resource Development. And before pursuing her doctorate, she held technical and managerial positions in industry for over 12 years. And now, without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Ferraro with gratitude.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here with you and grateful. I want to thank Stephanie for asking me to share a book with you. Before I got started, I thought I'd share why Vanguard. And like many of you, this past summer was challenging for me. And it wasn't new. And maybe that's why it was so challenging for me. I remember that the year Michael Brown was killed, I was at a family wedding in Arizona. And one of my nephews, we were staying at this resort and it was surrounded by a neighborhood. And one of my nephews told me he was going to walk over to this little condo that we had. And an hour later, he didn't show up. And I just remember calling his cell phone and not getting an answer. And I didn't think like other people might. I didn't think, he just decided he didn't want to hang out with his old aunt and uncle. I just felt this kind of a cold fear, and I thought somebody in the neighborhood saw him walking around and called the cops. And I kept trying to call him, and finally he showed up and he said, "Hey, I got lost. I was walking through the neighborhood. I got lost. My cell phone died." And he was okay. And I was grateful and relieved. So this summer, when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered for jogging through a neighborhood, doing what other people do with impunity, I felt sick and tired of the fear, followed by gratitude, followed by nothing. Or the anger, followed by sadness, followed by, well, nothing or nothing much. And I wanted inspiration, and I needed it from Black women. And so when Martha Jones' book came out and I saw it, I thought, okay, I'm going to read that book. And once I read it, I said, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to use it in whatever platforms I have, and I hope that it'll inspire all of us to do something like the women that we're going to discuss today. So let's get started talking about those women. So here's the agenda. I'm going to share the stories of 5 women, and then we're going to engage in some discussion considering these prompts. Why are we better off learning history, this particular history, and that's Ibram Kendi's endorsement of the book. We talk some about Black women's political participation and beyond, the barriers that there are to the participation of Black women, and what that might mean for us individually and collectively, especially as members of the SU community. So here are the 5 women that I'm going to discuss: Marianne Shad, Hallie Quinn Brown, Pauli Murray, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Stacey Abrams. And their collective work and experience span almost 200 years. And I just think that's great. I was talking earlier about how dominant narratives make it seem that there's no history except white history. And when I look at these women over 200 years, it just inspires me, makes me want to challenge the dominant narrative all the more and more loudly. So, what's happening in the world when Marianne Shad is on the scene? And we'll start with her. Well, the first thing is that slavery almost tripled in size the slave population between 1790 and 1830. So in 1830, when Shad would have been about 7 years old, the population was 12.8 million U.S. citizens, and 2 million of those were slaves. I shouldn't say citizens because they weren't citizens. They were just 2 million enslaved people. The violence and brutality of slavery was really apparent when enslaved people chose to rebel because they were willing to kill and to be killed. And during her lifetime, Denmark Vesey's plot in 1822 would have been found out, and Nat Turner's bloody revolt in 1831 would have occurred. And the fear among enslavers in the aftermath of these insurrections, these rebellions, led to more stringent control of enslaved people. Some Blacks were living free, and by 1830, the total number of free Blacks was about 319,000, and believe it or not, only less than half of them, about 150,000, lived in the North. So most of them were living in the South. And free Blacks were forming these vibrant communities. They were founding educational institutions, the HBCUs that we think of today. Frederick Taylor had started the North Star newspaper to advocate for an end to slavery. So let's talk about Shad. So Marianne Shad was born free in a slave-holding state, Delaware. And how many of you knew that Delaware was a slave-holding state? I did not know that. This is one of the things I love about learning history because it busts all of the myths about the pervasiveness of slavery in the United States. Her parents, Abraham and Harriet Shad, moved the family to Pennsylvania so that their children could be educated. And in 1853, Shad decides to migrate to Windsor, Ontario, as many other Black folks did, to escape the United States. But as I read the book, I was like, why would she relocate? She was born free. She was in the North. She was educated. Why would she choose to go to Windsor? And according to Jones in Vanguard, people immigrated because they didn't believe that the United States would ever acknowledge them as free citizens. And their concerns were supported by the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which threatened to return not only escaped enslaved people back to bondage, but free Northern Blacks. And a free Black could be captured and sold just based on the affidavit of a white person saying they were owned. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave or read the book, you know of that real life experience. So Shad and her brother Isaac moved to Canada and they settled in Windsor, Ontario. And there she begins to create free Black settlements, and she acted first in securing her own safety and freedom and then seeking to secure the safety and freedom of other people. She was a journalist, and she used her gifts to advocate for the rights of free as well as enslaved Blacks. I think Shad is one of my heroes because she wasn't satisfied just to be free. She recognized that she wasn't free because the apparatus of government in the United States was always threatening her rights. They were always creating the conditions by which Black folks, even in the North, could not experience equity or even safety. She spoke truth to power, even the activist structure. Specifically, I've been trying to get a hold of this letter. One of the things she's known for is a letter that she wrote to Frederick Douglass, which he published in the North Star, where she commented, "We should do more and talk less." She was not just an activist. I would argue that she was also an entrepreneur. She published the Provincial Freeman and had to find a business model that allowed it to stay afloat. And she reminds us about the importance of considering what happens at the intersection of race and gender. Although she's the publisher of the Freeman, she has to adopt a persona to mask her sex, at least until she was married. And she frequently used her role as an editor to tell the stories of women's rights, to celebrate women's accomplishments, and to help married women understand what their legal rights were. The paper, under her leadership, advocated for the rights of women to speak in public, to hold office, to control property, and to enter the professions. And she promoted the work, always was promoting the work of other Black women, like Frances Ellen Watkins, Sojourner Truth, and Amelia Freeman. As I tell you each of the stories, I'm going to also tell you what I learned as I was reading the book about myself and about what I think is important. So the first thing that I learned from her is to pay attention to what's happening in the world. And she saw what was happening with the Fugitive Slave Act, and she acted in ways that kept herself free and safe. And today I'm often wondering if I'm really reading the signs of the times or if I'm denying them. The other thing that I learned is, she was a journalist, and she used her skills to advance the conversation, to advocate for freedom and for Black rights. And I sometimes wonder if I'm running all over the place trying to think about how to make a difference when I can be an activist as a professor in what I teach and what I write about, where I write, and as a citizen through my voting and my marching and other things. The other thing I learned is, wherever you are, wherever I am, I want to amplify the voices of Black women. I want to support them as she did and to amplify their voices in whatever platforms I have. And the final thing I learned is that there is no perfectionism in activism. As I learned more about her, I actually have been reading about her in other books. I saw that I wouldn't always agree with her, at least as I am today. She talks a lot about respectability politics, that there's some assimilation that would be a good thing. But she was working to do what she believed and elevating the voices of Black women and helping others to live lives that were freer. And so there's no perfection. We need to be working and doing what we believe. And that's what she was doing. So the next woman I'm going to talk about is Hallie Quinn Brown. And so what was happening in the U.S. during Hallie Quinn Brown's lifetime? This is a quote from the New York Times. "We are two peoples. We are a people for freedom and a people for slavery. Between the two, conflict is inevitable." Does that feel familiar to today or what? This is at the beginning of the Civil War. Hallie Quinn Brown lived in some very interesting times in our country. She was born into the time that the country was on the verge of civil war. No doubt she heard her parents and other adults talk about John Brown and Harper's Ferry. She would have heard about Black men being denied the opportunity to participate in the war, and then hear that Lincoln changed his mind as the war dragged on. She might have known people who were in the war. She lived through that war and the promise of Reconstruction. She would know about the men who were elected to, the Black men who were elected to the United States Senate seats in the South, including Mississippi. And she would have also seen the dashed hopes of Reconstruction as the Supreme Court made the decision on Plessy and Ferguson that made the doctrine of separate but equal the law of the land. and made Jim Crow and the racial violence that ensued around it permissible. And don't be fooled, Jim Crow was included in northern states like Delaware. And Brown saw the rise of the women's suffrage movement and how racism infiltrated that movement as well. So like Shad, Brown was born free, though her parents had been enslaved. Like Shad, education also caused her family to move. They migrated to Canada when Brown was a teenager. And after the Civil War, Brown returned to the United States and enrolled where? That's right, she went to my alma mater, Wilberforce University in Wilberforce, Ohio. She was an educator and taught at a variety of schools in the South, including Tuskegee Institute. Like other Black women, Brown's activism seems to have been fostered. Her leadership developed in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she held the office of Secretary of Education. Brown was a suffragist, but she wasn't part of the white suffragist organizations, and Martha Jones speculates that this was because of anti-Black racism within those organizations. However, she was a member of the National Association of Colored Women in 1911 and 12, and she headed their suffrage department, and in 1920, she became president of that organization. The activism that I love that she engaged in was about a mammy statue that was proposed by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the UDC. And this really grips my imagination and gives me inspiration for things that I should be engaged in. So here's the story. The UDC wants to dedicate this statue of the Black Mammy of the South, which depicts a Black woman cradling a white infant. And in recounting this story and Brown's views, Jones helps us to understand that the mammy figure was part of the lost cause myth, a part of a dominant narrative about the South as this gentle, beautiful place where Black folks were happily enslaved until that nasty Civil War and the pro-government, big government folks from the North showed up. Can you hear echoes of that today? Brown, along with other activists like W.E.B. Du Bois, made sure that that bill died, that that monument never got made. And Brown was thinking about what we now call representational intersectionality long before we had a name for it. And she said, I don't believe that this is a benign effort to bring honor to these Black women. I believe that if you wanted to do that, she doesn't call it this, but she's like, make some reparations. Tell your men to stop lynching folks. If you really care about the Black women of the South. And what representational intersectionality says is that the cultural depictions of Black women can obscure their authentic lived experience. And Brown goes on to say to these women who the UDC, want to put this mammy up, that these Black women that you say you want to honor were sexually assaulted, they were treated abominably, that the children that they were carrying were often their own children as a result of sexual assault. And so, this is really, I think, strong language to share with these women who say that they're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. This wasn't about Black women at all, is what Brown was saying, but it was about what white supremacists wanted to advance as who Black women are. And I think it's wonderful the way that she used her voice. I love her injunction for women to see the opportunities that exist for activism. And specifically, she states that women's horizons are expanding, that women are making history. And she says, what manner of women are we going to be? And so she writes this book to help young women know about enslaved Black women and who they truly were. Not these mammy stereotypes, but women who purchased their freedom, who escaped to freedom, who sued their enslavers for their freedom. And so she's like, if we're going to create a monument, let's create a monument to the real women who were enslaved. Later in Brown's history, she had to be on the front lines about another monument, and this was to suffragists, and it only included white women, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she was concerned that Black women were not represented in this monument. And so she made that known to the white women suffragists about her concerns, but in this case, she didn't prevail. And they did sort of these ceremonial things. They made sure that the National Council Association of Colored Women were invited. And they even had a banner that they put up when the monument went out. But the Black women had come asking for legislation that would prevent state laws from barring Black women from voting once the 19th Amendment was passed, but that was rejected by these white women suffragists. Black women were not included on the political agenda of the National Women's Party, which chose to only represent the interests of white women. So what did I learn from Brown's example? Representational intersectionality really matters. So what stories are being told about Black women in the popular culture that aren't really about us, but about trying to press a dominant narrative that other people want to advance? I need to keep asking the question. This is her quote: "Let us not ask what we shall do with our power, rather what manner of women are we to be?" And she's sort of like, it's not just about the power, but if we know who we are, then we know what we're going to do with the power. So who are we going to be? And finally, writing is activism. She wrote Homespun Heroes, that's about these Black women, as I said earlier, and these enslaved Black women telling their stories was really part of our activism. I see that the Mammy Monument activism and homespun, writing Homespun, they're the same thing. They're her trying to make sure that the real story of Black women is out there. That was part of the same fight. The third woman I want to talk about is Pauli Murray. So what would have been going on in Pauli Murray's lifetime? Well, The Birth of a Nation opens, as you know, a deeply white supremacist movie that re-energized the Ku Klux Klan. And you have the Urban League, and you have the NAACP, and the Black newspapers coming out with campaigns to protest the portrayal of Black people in the movie. And so the film, as a result, is banned in many communities throughout the United States. The grandfather clause, which said you could only vote if your grandfather had voted, which ruled out many Black people being able to vote, was overturned. And for many of us might know that the Divine Nine, the African American sororities and fraternities, were founded, which was another way of engaging in political and social action. So Pauli Murray, I had never heard of Pauli Murray until this summer, when a colleague, many of you will know, Jody O'Brien, shared her story with me. And I have to say, I became a little obsessed with getting information about her life and story. I bought her autobiography. She has a book of poetry. I just thought, why didn't I know this woman who Thurgood Marshall said that her 1951 book, States Laws on Race and Color, was the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement? I know Thurgood Marshall, and I don't know the woman that he thinks wrote the Bible on the Civil Rights Movement. Why didn't I know that in 1966, Murray helped found the National Organization for Women? I know now. I didn't know that she helped to found it. And why didn't I know that in 1977, she became the first African American ordained as an Episcopal priest? So when I read about her in Vanguard, I was reminded again of how important her story is, Like Brown, Murray is someone who wanted to call attention to intersectional dynamics. In particular, she called out Jane Crow to help bring attention to the disparate treatment of men and women, even when they worked alongside one another. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But according to Jones, Murray came into politics when she had an experience traveling while Black. She traveled from New York to Durham, North Carolina, and they had a lot of people who wanted to take the bus, and so they put her and another friend of hers on an inferior bus where the seats for the Black riders were broken. And so she and her friend, they went to the driver and they asked, very reasonably if you asked me, can you rearrange the Black passengers so that there would be more seats that were not broken for the Black passengers? And he refused, and he pushed her, and they argued, and she was arrested. And she was charged ultimately with disturbing the police. And according to Jones, this confrontation was the beginning of her activism. She met Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers from Howard University, and then she decided to study law there. And what did she discover at Howard? Sexism was very prevalent among people who were fighting for racial justice. She found this her own place to belong in an undergraduate women's dorm where students came to her because of her knowledge and her generosity in sharing what she knew about the law. And in law school, she was denied opportunities like joining the law fraternity because she was a woman. For those of you who don't know, Howard is a historically Black university. And when she protested, her professor and mentor, a Black man, told her that he wasn't that sympathetic, and if she wanted to start a parallel sorority, he would be supportive of that. Murray developed a network of other young women at Howard who were similarly engaged in activism, and that network connected her to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And by 1943, and I just want you to think about the year for a minute, by 1943, she had developed a theory of nonviolent resistance combined with what she called American techniques of showmanship. And this theory, so when we think about nonviolent resistance, we don't think about it from 1943. We don't think about a Black woman. We don't know Pauli Murray's name, many of us. So the theory was first tested at a DC cafe where a group of 3 Black women insisted on being served, and they were overcharged for their efforts. And instead of paying the inflated bill, they paid what they owed, and they were arrested and jailed. So Pauli Murray arranged a protest where people were with a friend of hers who was also talking about nonviolent resistance, thinking about how to affect it. So they arranged a protest where people were seated patiently, well-dressed, quietly inside, and then they had a group of people who were protesting outside, specifically about the participation of Blacks in the war, saying things like, we can die for this country, but we can't get a cup of coffee. And she and the protesters won the day. I'll close Pauli Murray's story by sharing words that she stated about becoming the first Black woman Episcopal church priest 172 years after the ordination of the first Black man into the priesthood. She clarified that she was not a first. I supported the women who went ahead of me in the church ministry, and it was their agony which made my own ordination possible. So what have I learned from Murray's example? Let's just say it again, intersectionality really matters. Even among Black folks, where we're on one accord about racial justice, we may still oppress women, and we have to stop ignoring intersectional oppression or oppression at the intersections. Creativity is necessary for activism. We need imagination. This idea of pairing nonviolent resistance with showmanship, making sure that it gets on the news, making sure that it gets in the media. It made a difference for not only the civil rights struggle for racial justice, but for many equal rights struggles. We've seen nonviolence resistance used in the LGBTQ struggles and struggles throughout the world. So very important to think about, again, the creativity that Pauli Murray brought to it. And then, I am not a first, even when it seems like that to other people, even when it might seem like that to me. And I have to support other women and other oppressed people because it's a collective struggle. That their struggles add to my struggles, make my successes possible. My achievements are the results of the struggles of other people. Let's talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. So what would have been happening during Fannie Lou Hamer's lifetime? Red Summer, which was the summer of 1919, summer of lynchings, white supremacist terrorism, racial riots that took place in more than 36 cities across the United States. Black servicemen returning from the war were often lynched in their uniforms. Black Wall Street was destroyed and 39 people were killed, 26 of whom were Black. Ida B. Wells goes on the offensive against lynching and uses her journalist skills to call attention to domestic and racial terrorism. And later in Fannie Lou Hamer's life, we have the March on Washington and the assassination of Dr. King. Could we talk about Vanguard without talking about Fannie Lou Hamer? I loved learning more about her story. Fannie Lou Hamer, I believe, makes it possible for there to have been a Barack Obama, a Barbara Jordan, a Keisha Lance Bottoms, because she helped breathe life into the Voting Rights Act. Okay, so who is Hamer if you don't know her? She was a leader of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was a sharecropper, and her life of activism seems to have started in 1962 when local officials prevented her and others from registering to vote. And she decided that now was the time to make the U.S. Constitution live up to its promises. And she called attention to literacy tests and terror acts at the polls, all the things that were preventing Black people from voting. I think what Joan's book showed me, what Vanguard showed me for the first time, was how Hamer's body was desecrated by racism. I mean, I've watched Eyes on the Prize and other coverage which shows the dogs and the water cannons and the batons. But Hamer's story is about how racism didn't just occur when she engaged in activist work. Racist doctors gave her a hysterectomy without her consent or knowledge, and we know this still happens. Remember what was happening at the border with Latinas in 2020. Racist police had her beaten by two of her fellow prisoners until they were exhausted. She was sexually assaulted by the police. She lost sight in her left eye. She suffered permanent kidney damage, and she already had a limp which was worsened by her encounter with the police. She's best known for her appearance at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, where she went to protest and to displace the Democratic Party's representatives who were designated without the representation of Black citizens because they were denied the vote. She negotiated with party officials, presidential agents, and civil rights leaders until she was on the agenda. And Jones makes quite a point about how Hamer was dressed to signal that she was there on political business. So Hamer tells her story about what attempting to register to vote, a civil right that is really guaranteed by the Constitution, what it cost her. It cost her her job. It cost her her eyesight, this brutal assault. And Lyndon Johnson scheduled a broadcast to interrupt the convention when Hamer was doing her talk, to draw attention away from her story. But Hamer went on and told her story anyway, and people stayed and they listened. and later her full remarks were broadcast. Many of us on this Zoom call have probably seen Hamer tell her story, and probably haven't seen whatever Johnson had to say that day. I love this line from the book. Hamer had managed the unthinkable. She had elevated her person, her story, and the politics she embodied, that of a Black woman sharecropper turned handbag-toting political operative, to national consequence. Americans were tuned in to the struggle for voting rights as never before, and we had Hamer to thank for it. So what have I learned from her example? Do it anyway, even when it hurts physically. Do it anyway, even when people try to disrupt your message. Don't be ashamed of who I am. Hamer was a sharecropper, and there are times when I have made myself small because my history isn't like other folks. And I look at her and I think, be yourself and change the world from where you are, who you are. And the last person I'm going to talk about is Stacey Abrams. So what's happening in the U.S. during Abrams' lifetime? Just have a list for you. Tom Brady became the first Black mayor of L.A. Maynard Jackson became the first Black mayor of Atlanta. Coleman Young became the first Black mayor of Detroit, my hometown. Barbara Jordan becomes the first Black woman to deliver a keynote at the Democratic National Convention, and Barack Obama becomes the first Black president of the United States of America. So Stacey Abrams. You know, I just started following her a few years ago when she ran for governor of Georgia. She became someone I wanted to know more about. So to see her in Vanguard with these other women leaders just seemed appropriate. And it's apropos that we mentioned Maynard Jackson on the previous slide because Abrams works for him at one time. She challenges him at a public forum, and that is what earned her a place on his staff. So she gets her law degree, she becomes a city attorney for Atlanta, and she goes to the Georgia State Assembly. And like many of the other women in the book, Abrams looks to those who went before her for wisdom on how to be anti-racist, to be an activist. She learned about voting rights in her own home, in her own family, because her grandmother got tired of trying to vote. Her grandmother had been sprayed by fire hoses. She'd been attacked by dogs. And when the Voting Rights Act was passed and she couldn't vote, well, she wasn't just tired, she also was terrified. And she just wasn't ready to go to the polling places again. But Abrams' grandfather reminded her of the costs that had been paid for folks to vote, the jail time, the fighting that their children had done to gain the right to vote, and Abrams' grandmother finds the strength to get out and vote. We all know Abrams because of the improprieties that were associated with her own election, and rather than sabotage the entire system, hint, hint, she created a political action organization called Fair Fight to ensure fair and free elections going forward. And I dare say that this year we have really seen the fruit of Abrams' labors. My favorite quote from the book from Abrams is on page 275. I'm sorry, I should have had that open. And she says, I'm a Black woman who's in a conversation about possibly being second in command to the leader of the free world, and I will not diminish my ambition or the ambitions of other women of color by saying that that's not something I'd be willing to do. I think what that says is that we hear a lot of folks, one of the things that she also says is that she's learned not to be bound by what she can see. And we hear a lot of folks saying you can't be what you can't see, but Abrams doesn't say that. I think she's saying dream of and fight for anything, as the women in this book did, as our four mothers did I love that the book closes with Abrams. She's the last word in the book, who clearly is part of the vanguard and seeing into the future. She's marching ahead of the army of women who drive us toward equity. So thank you. That's the end of my prepared remarks. And here are the questions I'd like for us to consider. I can leave these up or I can take them down because I'll be able to see them. But, Kendi in his endorsement of the book says, why are we better off learning this history? How has Black women's political participation and beyond political participation been important to the U.S.? What are some barriers to Black women's participation, and what does experiencing this history mean for us individually and collectively, especially as members of the SU community?
We have some notes of gratitude coming in for you, Holly. Summer says, thank you. I can't wait to get this book and share it with the social justice caregiver group I'm a part of in my organization. And then Heather Williams from Advancement said, thank you, Dr. Ferraro. These are the important historical figures that we have largely been erased, that have largely been erased from what we've been taught as U.S. history, which you were just naming. I'm so grateful to learn about this book. If we don't have an honest picture of who we are and where we've been and challenged the predominant narratives, as you stated so well, then how will we ever be able to chart a better path forward? So I just wanted to share that gratitude, because I know sometimes it's hard to read the chat as you're also answering questions, and I wanted you to feel that love in real time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I was saying earlier today, I was telling Stephanie that someone asked me to speak earlier today about racism, anti-racism. And I think one of the things that also happens in American history, and folks can challenge me or agree, is that, when we talk about American history, sort of go, so white men made the country great. Founding fathers were white men. All the heroes of the wars are white men. White women helped win the vote for all women. And yes, there are some Black, Indigenous, and other people of color heroes, but they're really heroes for Black people or for Indigenous people. They're not like national heroes. And I think what's so interesting when you're reading Vanguard is that we, and other books like the one that you just mentioned, I think I just bought the book that you're talking about. These women helped, they are national heroes. That we don't tell their stories in that way is really a disservice to them, but it's also a disservice to the country. It does not show who we are and where we've come from and who helped us to come from those places. So, yeah. I think, maybe in the last few minutes that we have here, as we think about our SU community, what should we be doing around telling these stories too? Someone was just telling me, I'm not going to remember her name now, but someone was telling me about an SU professor from like the 50s, or maybe she was a staff member, who did all this amazing work in the community. And I was thinking, why haven't I heard of her before? And I'm wondering about having a vanguard of SU. Like, what are the stories of Black women on our own campus that are erased, that we don't know? So I don't know if others have thought about that or have stories that we should be telling about how SU, who has helped make SU what it is today. And by the way, this particular SU woman, someone told me that there is a bust of her over at University of Washington. I was like, that's interesting. She's an SU, I believe she's an SU alum and also worked here, and that her bust would be over at UW but not here is also interesting. I tell you, there were so many women to talk about, and it also made me, I've been reading this book about storytelling for social justice. Mm-hmm. And they talk about what stories are the stock stories and what are the concealed stories. You know, one of the things that they say in that book, that the book made me think about is, what are the stock stories about Black women? Like, there are stories that I have heard over and over and over again. And what are the concealed stories? And I do think some of these concealed stories are the ones where Black women have just, you know, they have just really changed things, and their names for some reason are not known, but they just endured all kinds of stuff, and they made such a significant difference. So I just think that that's interesting. Even in this place, who are the stories we decide to tell and who aren't? So I chose not to tell some of the stories that we've heard so many times. Like, we all know Mary McLeod Bethune. Not that that's not an amazing story and an amazing woman, but many of us have heard that story our whole lives. But we never heard of Pauli Murray. I never heard of Pauli Murray. And so I just think that's interesting. Why not talk about her? And, you know, I will just say, if you read the book and learn more about her, she's also, I went to her, there's a website about her. She's also kind of a gender nonconforming person. So she uses he, him pronouns sometimes, they, them sometimes, she, her sometimes. And I'm like, is that why we don't know her story? Because it was too difficult for folks to grapple with the gender identity piece, that intersectional identity piece. So I think that those kinds of things are also interesting within our own community.
So again, Dr. Ferraro, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for giving your time. I know you had a really busy morning as well, and I know you're doing a lot of research as well right now. So thank you for taking the time to walk us through this text and to bring make a lot of us aware of this book. I've really enjoyed reading it, and will continue. I was telling a colleague in the chat that I'll continue to keep coming back to it because there's so much to peel apart there, and kind of piece together, like, what did I learn in school around this, and what's the real history. And so thank you everyone for taking time in your afternoon. I hope that you all are well, wherever you are in the world, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you so much for the conversation just now. I just really appreciate it, and for coming. All right, take care.